She was 19 and had been cast out before the first snows. She had no family, no plan, and just $3 in the pocket of her worn coat. And with that money, she bought a ruined ranch house in a forgotten Montana valley. But what nobody knew, what she could not have possibly imagined, was that hidden deep within the stone walls of the old well was a secret that would not only save her, but would build her a new life from the ground up. If you believe in the quiet power of forgotten things and the legacies left behind by strangers, subscribe to our channel for more stories like Elsie's. Elspeth May Collins was born in the autumn of 1888 in a small cabin tucked into a fold of the Bitterroot Valley, a place where the mountains were sharp against the sky and the winters were long and unforgiving. Her father, Thomas Collins, was a man shaped by the hardness of the land, a prospector whose dreams of gold had long since faded into the grit of a ranch hand's life, leaving him quiet and stern, with a disappointment that seemed to settle in his bones like the cold. Her mother, Sarah, was a softer presence, a woman from the East whose constitution was no match for the high country air. She taught Elsie her letters and numbers, how to sew a straight seam, and the names of the wild plants that could be used for medicine or for food. Yarrow for a fever, bitterroot for a hungry belly. But Sarah's breath grew shorter with each passing winter, and when Elsie was 12, she faded away like a ghost, leaving behind only the scent of dried lavender and a hollow space in the small cabin. Thomas, lost in his own grief and ill-suited for raising a daughter alone, married again within the year. His new wife, Agnes, was a pragmatic woman with a sharp gaze and hands that were always busy but never gentle. She saw Elsie not as a daughter, but as another mouth to feed, another chore on an endless list. So Elsie grew up in the spaces between things, between the silent disapproval of her father and the cold efficiency of her stepmother. She found her home not within the walls of the cabin, but outside, under the vast Montana sky. She learned the language of the wind in the pines and the patterns of the seasons in the flow of Lost Horse Creek. She was a quiet, observant child, and her solitude sharpened her senses. She noticed things others missed, the subtle shift in a cloud formation that foretold a storm, the faint track of a coyote in the dust, the way a fence post had begun to lean just so, weakened by rot at its base. It was this quality, this steady, watchful competence, that was recognized by their only neighbor, Silas Blackwood. Silas was an old widower who lived on a small homestead a mile down the creek. He had been a carpenter in his younger days, and his hands, though gnarled with age, still held a deep understanding of wood and iron. He saw in Elsie a spirit that mirrored his own, self-reliant and patient. He began to teach her, not with long lectures, but with quiet demonstrations. He showed her how to hold a saw so it wouldn't bind, how to read the grain of a pine board to anticipate its strengths and weaknesses, and how to drive a nail in 3 clean strokes. He taught her how to sharpen an axe, how to splice a rope, how to mix a poultice for a sick calf. He never praised her with effusive words, but his approval was there in the small nod he gave when she set a post straight and true, or in the way he'd hand her a more complex task without instruction, trusting she had watched and learned enough to figure it out. He spoke of the tools he used as if they were old friends, each with its own history and temperament. He preferred larch for its resistance to rot and pine for its honest grain. His world was one of practical things, of problems that could be solved with skill and patience, and in that world, Elsie found a sense of purpose and belonging that her own home had never offered. When she was 17, a month before a sudden pneumonia took him, Silas pressed his own pocket knife into her hand. It was a simple, single-blade knife, the handle made of staghorn worn smooth and dark with years of use. His initials, SB, were crudely carved into one side. "A good tool is an honest friend," he told her, his voice raspy. "It won't lie to you. It does the job it's meant for, or it doesn't." For Elsie, the knife was more than just a tool. It was a talisman, a connection to the only person who had ever truly seen her, who had valued her for the quiet strength she possessed. It was a reminder that her hands were capable, that she knew how to fix what was broken. It was a legacy of competence, a small, hard truth she could hold in her hand when everything else felt uncertain. The end of her life in the Bitterroot Valley came as quietly and coldly as the first frost of late autumn. Her father, Thomas, was killed in a fall from a spooked horse while mending a fence line in the high pasture. With him gone, the thin cord that had tethered Elsie to the homestead was severed. Agnes, her stepmother, wasted no time. She had no love for the hardscrabble life, no attachment to the land that had taken both her husband and her predecessor. Her plan was simple and swift: sell the small, indebted ranch and use the money to buy a train ticket back to Ohio, where her sister lived in a town with paved streets and a haberdashery. Elsie, now 19, was a loose end, a final piece of business to be dealt with before Agnes could close that chapter of her life for good. There was no confrontation, no heated argument, no dramatic scene of pleading or tears. The cruelty was in the transaction, in its clean, administrative finality. Elsie had spent the day replacing a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen pine, her hands raw from the cold and the rough wood. When she walked back to the cabin as dusk settled over the valley, she saw it immediately. A single worn carpet bag sat on the porch, its sides bulging with the few clothes and personal items she owned. The cabin door was closed. Agnes stood behind the screen, a dark silhouette against the dim lamplight inside. She did not open the door. Her voice came through the mesh, flat and devoid of emotion. "The place is sold, Elsie. The papers were signed this morning. The new family arrives in 3 days." She paused, as if reciting a memorized speech. "I'm taking the morning coach out of the valley. I can't take you with me." A small silence hung in the cold air, broken only by the sound of the wind in the eaves. Then something slid across the wooden porch boards, glinting in the fading light. "This is all I can spare. 3 silver dollars." Elsie looked down at the coins, then back at the closed door, at the shape of the woman who was erasing her from her life. She felt a strange calm settle over her, a cold, clear stillness. There was nothing to say, no argument to be made. The decision was as solid and immovable as the mountains behind her. She did not beg. She did not cry. She simply gave a single, small nod, an acknowledgement of the fact. She bent down, her joints stiff from the day's labor, and her fingers closed around the cold metal of the coins. She picked up the carpet bag, its weight familiar in her hand. Without a final look back at the only home she had ever known, she turned and began to walk down the long, rutted track that led away from the ranch. Her other hand was deep in her coat pocket, her knuckles pressed against the worn staghorn handle of Silas Blackwood's knife. It was a small, hard point of certainty in a world that had just dissolved around her. The land and the sky were all she had left. She walked north, with no destination in mind, only a powerful instinct to put distance between herself and the life that had just ended. The landscape of her childhood, the familiar contours of the Bitterroot Range, receded behind her with every step. The air grew colder, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and the damp, earthy smell of fallen leaves. The larch trees, which Silas had always called the golden ghosts of autumn, were at the peak of their color, their needles a brilliant, fiery yellow against the dark green of the firs and the heavy gray of the sky. Soon they would fall, carpeting the forest floor in a soft, fragrant blanket, just before the snows came to bury everything in white. She moved through this changing world with the quiet endurance of a creature native to it. The first night, she found shelter in an abandoned line shack, its roof leaky, but its walls sound enough to break the wind. She ate a piece of the dry bread and hard cheese Agnes had packed in her bag, a final, perfunctory act of care that felt more like an insult than a kindness. She drank from a creek so cold it made her teeth ache, the water tasting of stone and distance. Her boots, though worn, were sturdy, and her body was strong from years of physical work. She was not afraid of the solitude or the hardship of the journey. They were familiar companions. Her mind, free from the daily weight of her stepmother's disapproval, became clear and sharp. She noticed everything: the way the wind whispered through a stand of aspen, the fresh tracks of a doe and fawn at a river's edge, the distant call of an eagle circling high above a ridge. She was an observer, cataloging the details of the world she passed through, measuring its resources and its dangers with a practical eye. After 4 days of walking, the terrain began to change. The mountains softened into rolling foothills, and the dense forest gave way to a wider, more open valley. The land here was drier, covered in sagebrush and hardy grasses that bent in the constant wind. In the distance, she saw a small cluster of buildings, barely a smudge against the vast landscape. As she drew closer, it resolved itself into a town, though it was hardly more than a crossroads. A single dusty street connected a general store with a false front, a saloon with swinging doors, a livery stable, and a handful of small, weathered houses. A sign, its paint faded and peeling, read "Redemption." It had the look of a place people washed up in, not a place they set out for. It felt temporary, a foothold against the wilderness that surrounded it on all sides. For Elsie, who had no past she cared to reclaim and no future she could yet imagine, it felt like a place to stop walking, at least for a while. She had $2 and some change left, and winter was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was a cold certainty pressing in from the north. She needed shelter, a place to anchor herself against the coming storm. On the far side of the valley, miles from the meager comforts of Redemption, stood a testament to failure. It was a derelict ranch house, a simple salt box structure slowly surrendering to the elements. The land it occupied was a 40-acre parcel of sagebrush and rock, bisected by a creek that had become choked with debris and thorns. The place was an afterthought, a piece of land so poor and remote that no one had bothered to claim it for years. To most eyes, it was a ruin, a symbol of a dream that had died. But Elsie, standing on the rise overlooking it, saw something else. She saw good bones. The house was built of rough sawn pine, its planks weathered to the silver gray of old driftwood. The cedar shake roof had been torn away on the windward side, leaving the rafters exposed like the ribs of a skeleton. But the main structure was still square. A fieldstone chimney, assembled by a patient and skillful hand, stood tall at the north end, listing only slightly. The front porch had collapsed into a pile of rotting lumber, and every pane of glass in the 2 small windows was shattered, leaving dark, vacant eyes. She walked the perimeter, her steps slow and deliberate. The main building was roughly 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay and nesting mice. A single large room dominated the ground floor, dominated by a wide hearth and blackened firebox. A crude but sturdy ladder led to a small sleeping loft that ran the length of half the house. The pine plank floor was buckled from moisture in several places, and a few boards were rotten through, but much of it felt solid under her boots. She saw not what was, but what could be. She saw the potential for warmth in the solid chimney, the promise of shelter in the straight roofline, the possibility of a life within the 4 square walls. She walked back into Redemption and found the county clerk's office, a small, dusty room at the back of the general store. The clerk, a man named Elias Vance, was sallow-faced and weary, a man buried under a mountain of paper in a land that cared little for it. Elsie stated her purpose plainly. "I'd like to inquire about the abandoned property north of town, the old Schmidt place." Vance sighed, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "That place? Been on the county rolls for 15 years. Seized it for back taxes after the old woman died. No heirs came forward." He pulled a heavy ledger from a shelf and ran a finger down a page. "It's worthless land. Water's unreliable, soil's no good for farming. No one's wanted it." He looked at her over his glasses, a flicker of curiosity in his tired eyes. "What would a young woman like you want with a ruin like that?" "I want to buy it," Elsie said, her voice even. Vance blinked. He looked around his cluttered office as if to confirm he was awake. "Buy it?" He let out a short, dry laugh. "The back taxes amount to $2.75. It's more trouble than it's worth to keep it on the books." He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "You give me your $3, he said, eyeing the silver coins she had placed on the counter between them. "I'll file the deed in your name, and we'll call the 75 cents a clerical fee. That'll make it clean." The transaction was as simple as it was absurd. He took a piece of heavy foolscap paper and with a scratchy pen wrote out the deed of sale, transferring ownership of 40 acres and 1 derelict house to Elspeth May Collins. He signed it with a flourish, pressed the county seal into a blob of warm red wax, and slid the document across the desk. "It's yours, miss," he said, a note of disbelief still in his voice. "The whole worthless lot of it. Good luck to you. You'll need it." Elsie folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her coat. She had traded all she had in the world for a pile of rotting wood and broken stone, but as she walked out into the cold afternoon light, she did not feel poor. She felt anchored. She had a place. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it was hers. Winter was coming on fast, a palpable presence in the wind that swept down from the high peaks. Before Elsie could even think about patching the roof or mending the walls, she needed a reliable source of water. Near the house stood an old well, its mouth a circle of dry stacked stone about 4 feet across, covered by a heavy, warped wooden lid. The windlass was gone. The rope and bucket rotted away to nothing. It was her only hope. She pried off the lid and peered into the darkness. The shaft was deep, maybe 30 feet, and the air that rose from it was cold and smelled of damp earth and stone. For a full day, she worked to clear it, hauling out years of accumulated debris, a thick mat of rotted leaves, the small bones of unlucky animals, rocks, and dirt that had washed in over time. When she finally reached the bottom, her heart sank. It was bone dry. The well had failed. Disappointed and weary, she was about to replace the heavy lid and abandon the effort when a flicker from her lantern caught her eye. 10 feet down from the surface, on the north side of the circular stone wall, one stone seemed different from the others. It was squarer, its edges less worn by time and weather, and the mortar around it, or what passed for mortar, looked fresher. It was a patch, a repair, but it was out of place. Curiosity overriding her exhaustion, she found a length of old, stiff rope in the collapsed barn and, after testing its strength, anchored it securely to a nearby pine. She looped it around her waist and, using a rickety ladder she'd also salvaged, began to lower herself carefully into the well shaft. The stone walls were cold and slick with a thin film of moisture. She braced her feet against the curved wall and examined the odd stone up close. It was indeed different. When she pushed against it, it wiggled slightly. Using the pry bar on the back of a hammer she'd found, she worked the tool into the crack and levered. The stone resisted, then scraped free with a grating sound, tumbling into the darkness at the bottom of the well. Behind it was a small, dark cavity, a space deliberately created within the thick wall. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against something wrapped in oilcloth. It was a box, heavy and solid, with her heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm. She worked the package out of its hiding place, secured it in a canvas sack, and laboriously hauled herself and her discovery back up into the fading light. Inside the shell of the house, with the wind whistling through the broken windows, she unwrapped the oilcloth. It was a biscuit tin, its painted flowers faded but still visible. She pried open the lid. The contents stole her breath. Nestled in dry cloth were stacks of U.S. gold coins, gleaming double eagles, eagles, and half eagles, their weight and solidity feeling impossible in her hands. Beneath them were bundles of banknotes, crisp and old. She did not stop to count it then, but she knew instinctively that it was a fortune, more money than she could have earned in 100 lifetimes. And beneath the money lay a folded piece of paper and a small, tarnished object. She carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting was neat, the ink faded to a soft brown. "To whoever finds this," it began. "My name is Anneliese Schmidt. I lived here with my husband, Jakob. We built this house in 1865. He was a stonemason. I was a teacher. We had no children. He died in the winter of '72 from a fever, and I have lived here alone since. I am old now, and my heart is tired. This is our life's savings. We had no family to leave it to, and I do not trust banks. I fear it will be lost when I am gone, or taken by men who do not deserve it. So I hide it here, in the well Jakob built with his own hands. Use it to make a life here. This land is hard, but it is honest. Do not let this house fall to ruin. It was a good home. I hope it will be for you too. Anneliese Schmidt, May 1883. Elsie read the words twice, her fingers tracing the elegant script. It was a voice from the past, a story of love and loss and foresight, left in the dark for a stranger. The last item in the box was a small silver locket. She opened the delicate clasp. On one side was a tiny, faded photograph of a man with a thick mustache and serious eyes, Jakob, the stonemason. The other side was empty, a polished, waiting surface. Elsie sat on the dusty floor as the last light of day vanished, the gold coins cool against her skin, the letter in her lap. Anneliese Schmidt's gift was more than money. It was a charge, a responsibility. It was the foundation for a future she hadn't dared to imagine just hours before. The discovery in the well changed everything. The desperate race against winter was no longer a matter of mere survival, but an opportunity for true restoration. Anneliese Schmidt's legacy gave Elsie the means, and Silas Blackwood's lessons gave her the skill. She spent an evening by candlelight making a careful, methodical list. The next morning, she bought a sturdy horse from the livery in Redemption and rode to the general store, her list and a single gold coin in her pocket. The store's owner, a portly, kind-faced man in his 50s named Abernathy, looked at her list of lumber, nails, window glass, and tools with wide eyes. "That's a big job for one person, miss," he said, not with doubt, but with a gentle concern. When she paid with a $10 gold piece, his eyebrows shot up, but he asked no questions, simply making change and arranging for a wagon to deliver the materials to the old Schmidt place. The arrival of the supply wagon was an event in the quiet valley. It announced her intentions to the scattered community. She was not just squatting in the ruin, she was rebuilding it. The work began with the roof, the most critical defense against the coming snow. She stripped away the rotten shakes, her hammer echoing in the vast silence. She remembered Silas showing her how to check a rafter for soundness, tapping it with a hammer and listening to the tone. She replaced the cracked and weakened timbers with new pine, the fresh-cut wood smelling sharp and clean in the cold air. Then came the slow, rhythmic work of roofing. She laid down sheets of black roofing felt, and then, using a chalk line to keep her courses perfectly straight, she began nailing on the new cedar shakes, one by one, overlapping each row precisely. It was hard, repetitive labor, but with each swing of the hammer, she felt a deep satisfaction, the feeling of creating shelter with her own hands. As she worked, people began to appear, drawn by curiosity and a quiet, unspoken code of the frontier. The first was Caleb Hale, the town blacksmith. He was a young man, not much older than her, with broad shoulders and a quiet demeanor. He had sharpened her saw blades, and he came by one afternoon on the pretense of checking her work. He saw the massive stone lintel over the fireplace, which had slipped and was resting at a precarious angle. "That's a two-person job," he stated simply. The next day he returned with heavy crowbars and wooden rollers. They worked together for hours, using leverage and strength, communicating with few words, their movements synchronized by the shared task. When the heavy stone was finally settled back into place, solid and secure, a silent bond of mutual respect had been forged between them. A few days later, Martha Vance, the clerk's wife, arrived in a buckboard. She was a woman in her 40s with gentle eyes and capable hands, known for her beautiful quilts. She had heard the story of the girl who bought the ruin. She carried a basket containing a steaming pot of beef stew, a loaf of fresh bread, and 2 thick wool blankets. "A body needs a hot meal when they're working this hard," she said, her words plain but her meaning deep. It was an offering of welcome, an acceptance into the small community. Elsie worked from dawn until dusk, her body aching but her spirit resolute. She chinked the walls with a mixture of mud, straw, and lime, sealing the house against the wind. She carefully set the new panes of window glass, glazing them with putty until they were airtight. She built a new door from thick pine planks, hanging it on heavy iron hinges Caleb had forged for her. She replaced the rotted floorboards and installed the cast iron wood stove, its black pipe rising straight and true through the new roof. Each task was a lesson learned from Silas, a memory of his patient hands guiding hers. She was not just rebuilding a house, she was inhabiting his teachings, proving them true. The ruin was slowly, painstakingly, being transformed back into a home. As the first heavy snows began to fall, blanketing the valley in a deep, silent white, the house was ready. It stood against the winter landscape not as a ruin, but as a bastion of warmth and light. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a signal of life against the gray sky. In the evenings, the soft glow of a lantern shone through the new glass windows, a beacon in the vast darkness. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a home, sealed tight against the storm. With the primary work of shelter complete, Elsie's life settled into the quiet, steady rhythms of the season. She had used a portion of Annalise's money to buy a gentle milk cow and a half-dozen laying hens from a neighboring rancher. Her days now had a comforting shape. Rising before dawn to the warmth of the stove, milking the cow in the cold, crisp air of the shed she had repaired, scattering grain for the chickens, chopping wood, and tending to the endless small tasks of a homestead. The work was constant, but it was purposeful. It was work that sustained her, that rooted her to the place. Every Sunday, she would ride her horse into Redemption for supplies. At first, the townspeople had watched her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Now, they nodded as she passed. Mr. Abernathy would have her usual order of flour, salt, and coffee ready for her. Martha Vance would wave from the doorway of her small house. She was no longer the strange girl who bought the ruin. She was Elsie from the Schmidt place. She was becoming part of the fabric of the community, woven in through quiet acts and shared seasons. Martha, seeing Elsie's solitude, invited her over on winter afternoons. In the warmth of Martha's kitchen, surrounded by colorful scraps of fabric, she began to teach Elsie the art of quilting. As they worked, their needles flying, they would talk. Martha spoke of her children, now grown and gone, and of the town's small histories. Elsie, in turn, slowly began to share pieces of her own story, speaking of Silas and the things he had taught her. She never spoke of the gold, but she spoke of Annalise Schmidt, of the letter, and of the feeling of being given a second chance. The quilting became more than a craft. It was a form of storytelling, of stitching a new life together from the remnants of the old. Caleb Hale became a regular visitor. He would often stop by on his way back from checking his trap lines, a brace of grouse or a rabbit for her stew pot in his hand. They would sit by the fire, drinking coffee, often in comfortable silence. He admired the sturdy table and chairs she had built, the neatness of her repairs, the competence that shone in everything she did. He saw a strength in her that matched his own. A quiet, unspoken affection grew between them, as steady and natural as the changing of the seasons. The land itself was changing under her care. She spent days clearing the choked creek, allowing the water to run clear and free. She rebuilt the collapsed fences, not with wire, but with split rails, the way Silas had taught her. In the shelter of the house, she studied seed catalogs Mr. Abernathy had given her, planning a large garden for the spring. The 40 acres of sagebrush and rock were no longer a worthless parcel. They were her land, her home, a place filled with purpose and the promise of a future. Deep winter settled over the valley, burying the world under a thick blanket of snow. A blizzard raged outside, the wind howling around the eaves of the small house. But inside, all was calm and warm. The fire in the great stone hearth crackled and hissed, and the cast-iron stove in the center of the room radiated a steady, bone-deep heat. Elsie sat at the small pine table she had built with her own hands, a cup of hot tea steaming between her palms. The home she had created was simple, functional, and filled with a profound sense of peace. Her gaze drifted to the hearth, to the massive lintel stone that Jakob Schmidt had set in place so many years ago, the same one that Caleb Hale had helped her reset. She thought of the hands that had built this place, the care and skill that had gone into every joint and stone. This house was a conversation across time, a collaboration between strangers. On the rough-hewn mantelpiece she had installed above the fireplace, 2 objects sat side by side. On the left was Silas Blackwood's staghorn knife, its blade polished, its handle dark with the memory of his grip. On the right was Anneliese Schmidt's silver locket, which she had polished until it shone. She had never opened it to look at Jakob's face again, content to let it remain a private testament. These two small things, left behind by people who had lived and worked and died long before she arrived, were the twin pillars of her new life. Silas had given her the skills, the knowledge, the quiet confidence in her own hands. Anneliese had given her the means, the unexpected gift that had turned a desperate flight into a deliberate act of creation. They were her benefactors, her invisible mentors, and in this warm, safe room, she felt their presence as a gentle, steadying force. She thought for a moment of her father and of Agnes. The memory no longer carried the sharp sting of rejection. It was a distant, faded thing. She felt a kind of quiet pity for them. They had looked at her and seen only a burden, a problem to be disposed of. They had cast her out with $3 silver, believing they were ridding themselves of a final responsibility. They could never have imagined this. They could never have understood that what they saw as a worthless girl could take a worthless piece of land and build a life richer and more real than any they had ever known. Their act of cold dismissal had not been an ending. It had been the beginning of everything. The $3, meant as a final paltry severance, had become the purchase price of her entire world. The cruelty she had endured had, through a strange and beautiful alchemy, led her to a kindness she had never expected to find, from the living and the dead. The life she now lived was not one she had been given, but one she had earned and built, nail by nail, stone by stone. Elspeth May Collins was 19 and homeless. She had $3 to her name, and she spent it on a ruin. It was the best $3 she ever spent. Anneliese Schmidt left a gift for a stranger, believing in a future she would never see. Her simple act of trust, a letter and a tin box hidden in the dark, changed Elsie's life forever. It reminds us that our choices can echo in ways we can't predict, providing shelter for those who come after. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of hidden kindness and unexpected legacies that ripple across generations. What small thing could you do today? What seed of hope could you plant that might become a foundation for someone else tomorrow?